On April 27, 2024 at 2:54 p.m., a 911 dispatcher in Robeson County received an unusual call. A young woman calmly asked if they could track her location. When the dispatcher inquired about the reason, the woman replied, "I just want my family to know where to find me." After these words, the connection was lost. Around the same time, 55-year-old Johnny Jacobs was fishing on the river in Lumber River State Park, North Carolina. The park's tranquil atmosphere was disrupted by a woman's crying coming from behind a dense line of trees. "I heard faint sobbing that lasted about 2 or 3 minutes, and then it suddenly stopped," Jacobs later recalled. A few minutes later, the silence was shattered by a loud gunshot. The alarmed fisherman headed in the direction of the sound. On the riverbank, he discovered a backpack containing glasses, a phone, credit cards, a small Bible, and documents in the name of Mica Miller. At 4:30 p.m., a kayaker passing nearby noticed a body in the water. The police, called earlier due to the 911 call, pulled the body of a 30-year-old woman with a gunshot wound to the head from the river. In the parking lot, a black Honda Accord belonging to the deceased was found. On the passenger seat lay a case for a Sig Sauer pistol, a box of ammunition, and receipts dated the same day, one from a pawn shop for the purchase of a weapon, the other from a grocery store. Later, a 9mm Sig Sauer pistol was retrieved from the water, its serial number matching the case in the car. The day after the tragedy, Pastor John Paul Miller, the victim's husband, made a surprising announcement at Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. "Late last night, I received a call. My wife has passed away. It was self-induced, it happened in North Carolina," he informed his congregation, asking them to quietly leave the church and not discuss the news inside the building. He also added, "You all knew that she was not mentally healthy and needed medication." This announcement, made less than a day after the body was discovered, when the official cause of death had not yet been established, raised the first suspicions among Mica's family. But to understand the full complexity of this case, we need to go back 15 years, when Mica and John Paul's story was just beginning. Mica Miller was born in the early 90s into a loving Christian family. The girl grew up in an atmosphere of faith and devotion to the church. Her parents instilled in their daughter the values of compassion, kindness, and service to others. When Mica was about 14 years old, the family began attending Solid Rock Baptist Church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. This church was distinguished by its dynamic community, where, in addition to services, a variety of events took place from cooking classes to yard sales. Solid Rock positioned itself as a second home for everyone, so the church soon became the center of life and communication for young Mica. It was here that the girl first met John Paul Miller, a charismatic 28-year-old youth pastor. Despite the age difference, a friendship developed between them. The experienced clergyman paid special attention to Mica, often talking with her after the service, taking an interest in her life. For a shy teenager who was just forming her identity, his support and guidance seemed like an invaluable gift. However, there was a noticeable power imbalance in this relationship from the beginning. John Paul, a married man and father of several children, skillfully manipulated the feelings of the young parishioner. He would shower her with compliments one moment and distance himself the next, causing confusion and a desire to please the mentor. But at that time, the naive Mica did not notice the alarming signals, mistaking the toxic attention for genuine affection. Over the next few years, John Paul increasingly took care of Mica's spiritual life. The girl confided in him her experiences and secrets, perceiving the pastor as a wise advisor. However, behind the feigned concern was a desire to strengthen control and isolate Mica from friends and family. Meanwhile, rumors spread in the church about the unusual friendship between the married pastor and the young parishioner. Some of the older members of the community tried to warn Mica against reckless trust, but the infatuated girl did not heed the voice of reason. In 2015, the relationship between John Paul and Mica reached a new level. At the pastor's request, the 18-year-old girl married his friend Jeremy Dace. John Paul himself officiated the wedding. the newlyweds settled in Myrtle Beach and immersed themselves in the life of the church. Jeremy worked in the sports ministry, while Mica helped in a Sunday school, sang in the choir, and served as John Paul's personal secretary. However, few suspected that the marriage to Jeremy was just a cover for the true romance that was secretly unfolding between the pastor and his protege. Eventually, the truth came out. Allison, John Paul's wife, caught the lovers right in their house. Stunned by the betrayal, Allison and Jeremy divorced their unfaithful spouses the following year and left the church. Only a small circle of the most devoted parishioners continued to communicate with Mica. Most condemned and shunned the young woman, considering her a homewrecker. In 2017, John Paul and Mica got married in the same Solid Rock church. Now the 23-year-old pastor's wife became a stepmother to his 5 children and his right-hand woman in church affairs. Despite the condemnation of the community, the couple radiated happiness and pretended as if nothing had happened. They dreamed of building a new life together and growing the congregation. But behind the facade of the perfect family hid a completely different reality. Marriage to John Paul dramatically changed Mica's life. Now she found herself in the midst of church activities. Mica continued to sing in the choir, did graphic design for the community's needs, and took care of women's and youth ministries. But she was most attracted to missionary work in Kenya, where Solid Rock funded religious and educational projects. Despite her busy schedule, Mica tried to be a good stepmother to John Paul's 5 children. She sincerely fell in love with his daughter Salem, often taking her shopping and doing her nails. The girl quickly became attached to her father's young wife. On the surface, the Millers' marriage looked perfect. John Paul appeared everywhere arm in arm with his smiling, beautiful wife. They led services together, hosted guests, and made plans to expand the church. It seemed that nothing foretold trouble. But behind the scenes of the happy church couple, a horrifying drama was unfolding. From the very beginning, John Paul exhibited pathologically jealous and despotic traits. He controlled Mica's every move, demanding an account of her every minute. He forbade her from meeting with friends or communicating by phone. For the slightest transgression, the pastor scolded, humiliated, and even beat his wife. Mica began to notice strange changes in John Paul's behavior. The clergyman, who constantly condemned adultery and pornography, turned out to be obsessed with sexual perversion himself. The man demanded intimacy from his wife 3 to 5 times a day. When the exhausted woman resisted, he found ways to force her to obey. John Paul even started giving Mica testosterone injections to increase her libido. The shocked woman tried to protest, but where could she go? The church, work, friends, her entire life revolved around the all-powerful pastor. So Mica was forced to silently endure the abuse, hoping that one day her husband would come to his senses. Years passed, and John Paul behaved worse and worse. He humiliated Mica in front of friends and threatened to take away the children. One time, he simply threw her things out on the street. Upon learning that his wife had complained about him, the pastor publicly accused her of having an unstable psyche. This continued until January 2023, when Mica, exhausted by the constant abuse, dared to escape from the church and her husband. She moved to her relatives in Kansas, hoping to start her life with a clean slate. At first, it seemed that the worst was behind her. Mica attended a new church, made friends, and made plans. But soon a strange thing happened. Barely a few months had passed when the woman suddenly returned to John Paul. She left her relatives brief and dry explanations like, "We made up and my husband allowed me to return home." This message bewildered her family. They knew how eagerly Mica had been waiting for a new life. Some suspected that John Paul had somehow forced her to return. However, the woman herself never spoke about the reasons for her actions. As one might expect, with the return to Myrtle Beach, the nightmare continued with renewed force. Control, manipulation, and beatings again became a terrifying routine. The desperate Mica no longer saw a way out. On social media, she shared cryptic posts where she spoke in veiled terms about bitter disappointment and pain.
So today my heart's a little heavy. I've had a lot of women that have reached out to me about situations of abuse. And I just want to tell you what a lot of people have told me lately and reminded me, because I think I forgot. I knew, but I pushed it in the back of my head just because of my situation.
But despite all the despair, the thought of salvation did not leave the tormented woman. In October 2023, she filed for divorce again. She began meticulously collecting evidence of John Paul's abuse to use in court. It seemed that the decisive moment in this exhausting war had finally come. Mica had no idea what an insidious plan her no longer beloved husband was preparing in response. In the spring of 2024, Mica was actively preparing for the divorce. She rented an apartment, got a job, and opened her own bank account. It seemed that life was gradually getting better. But John Paul had no intention of letting his wife go. He bombarded her with threatening messages, demanding that she return, promising to find her wherever she hid. One time, the enraged husband came to Mica's sister and threatened to wait outside the door with a weapon until his wife came out to him. Mica was forced to change phone numbers and hide at friends' houses. But even there, she did not feel safe. One morning, the woman discovered that her car tires were slashed. When she had to change the wheels, the mechanic found a GPS tracker under the vehicle. Someone was relentlessly tracking Mica's every move. The shocked woman went to the police again. But instead of help, she heard accusations of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It turned out that John Paul had already managed to complain to the cops about his mentally ill wife. He even showed some papers that supposedly confirmed her diagnosis. In the end, the perpetrator himself magnanimously withdrew the complaint, explaining that he loves Mica very much and just wants to take care of her. So February passed. At the beginning of March, an alarmed Mica reached out to her sister in Kansas. She wrote that she feared for her life and felt she was being followed. It seemed to the woman that John Paul was hiring people to follow her everywhere. In response, the man insidiously resorted to his favorite tactic. He accused Mica of insanity. But this time, he went even further. He claimed that his wife was suffering from paranoia and posed a threat to herself and others. And then he simply locked her up in a psychiatric hospital. The stunned woman found herself confined to a ward, without documents or contact with her relatives. Fortunately, Mica managed to get out of the hospital after just 2 days. However, during this time, John Paul had managed to remove all the key documents from her apartment, evidence of his numerous abuses. Now she had nothing in her hands that would help prove her husband's guilt in court. But despite the devastating blow, Mica did not give up. With the help of friends, she restored access to most of the documents within 2 weeks and filed for divorce again. It seemed that this time she had finally broken free. The hearing of the case was scheduled for early June. Mica was filled with hope that very soon she would begin a new life, calm, free, happy. She did not yet know that this life would last only a month. Exactly until that April day when a desperate voice would cry out to 911 with a plea for salvation. And no one would be able to come to that plea. April 27, 2024 began quite ordinarily for Mica. Surveillance cameras recorded the woman leaving her apartment around 10 in the morning and returning half an hour later. Then events spun with breakneck speed. Mica went to a pawn shop where she purchased a pistol and ammunition. Then she stopped at a gas station and bought a drink. The search queries entered into her phone indicate that the woman was looking for a location in a national park. At 2:54 p.m., Mica called 911. The perplexed dispatcher heard only one chilling question: "Can you track my phone? I just want my family to know where to find me." The woman refused to answer any further questions. And then the connection was unexpectedly lost. Within minutes, a shot rang out in the park. Fisherman Johnny Jacobs, who was boating nearby, said he heard a woman crying before the shot. He immediately headed toward the sound and came across the bloodied body of a young woman. The police who arrived at the scene recognized the murdered woman as 30-year-old Mica Miller. She had died from a single gunshot to the head at close range. Nearby in the water, they found a Sig Sauer pistol, and on the shore was Mica's backpack with documents and a farewell note to her relatives. In the woman's car lay a box from the newly purchased weapon and a cash receipt from the pawn shop. Surveillance cameras unequivocally confirmed that Mica herself had bought the gun, as well as the drink at the gas station. No one suspicious was seen with her. The police quickly reconstructed the chronology of the last hours of Mica's life. All the evidence clearly indicated that the woman had consciously and independently committed suicide. Investigators speculated that she may have been driven to the desperate act by the unbearable suffering in her marriage and a constant psychological pressure from John Paul. However, there was a lack of direct evidence of his guilt. The cruel pastor had an ironclad alibi. On that fateful day, he was hundreds of miles away from North Carolina, at a sports event in Charleston. Numerous witnesses and camera recordings confirmed that John Paul had not left South Carolina all weekend. So, despite all the atrocities, technically he could not have been with his wife in the park, and even more so could not have shot her. By a sad coincidence, Mica took her own life just at the time when her abuser was not around. The news of Mica's sudden death shocked everyone who knew her. People could not believe that this smiling, compassionate young woman, who so sincerely helped others, could have taken her own life. Something about this story did not add up. However, John Paul's behavior immediately after the tragedy raised even more questions. Instead of rushing home or to Mica's relatives in despair, he held the Sunday service the next day as if nothing had happened. And at the end, he casually announced to the congregation about his wife's death, as if it was some minor annoyance, not a life-altering tragedy. The pastor's indifferent tone, his clumsy attempts to tie Mica's suicide to her alleged mental illness, all of this seemed strange at the very least. But investigators did not see anything extraordinary in John Paul's actions. His alibi was solid, so he could only be suspected of imprudence or soullessness. Instead, the police quickly solved the case, recognizing Mica's death as a suicide. This version was supported by the woman's pre-death call to 911, where she unequivocally spoke about her intention to end her life. The history of her search queries about the location of parks, the video recording of the weapon purchase, and the cash receipt from the pawn shop also left no doubt. All the evidence indicated that Mica had purposefully, step by step, prepared for her fatal decision. And judging by the nature of the wound point-blank to the temple, death almost certainly resulted from her own hand. After all, the autopsy did not reveal any signs of struggle or violence on the body. There were also no indications of the presence of an outside shooter. However, the relatives refused to believe this version. They knew Mica as a cheerful, strong woman, full of hopes and plans. After all, quite recently, she had been preparing for the divorce with such enthusiasm, dreaming of her long-awaited freedom. Was it all just an act, behind which hid a desire for death? No, it's impossible to believe. Parents, brothers, and sisters unanimously asserted Mica did not want and could not have voluntarily settled scores with life. They recalled her chilling prophecy shortly before her death: "If they find me with a bullet in my head, know that JP did it." These are not the words of someone preparing for suicide. The relatives pointed to the long history of domestic violence and torture that Mica had suffered at the hands of her sadistic husband, to his obsessive control, persecution, and intimidation, which did not subside until the very end. Isn't it obvious that the pastor deliberately drove the poor woman to despair, and then ran away to another state to have an alibi? Unfortunately, the police did not take these arguments into account. The system does not recognize such a crime as driving to suicide. Even the worst psychological pressure and gaslighting cannot be considered a sufficient motive for murder if there is no other evidence. No matter how terrible John Paul's abuse was, technically he remained beyond suspicion. So, after a few weeks, the case was closed. John Paul was never interrogated. He did not hear a single accusation. He did not even have to publicly justify himself for the years of harassment his wife had endured. The sadistic pastor got off scot-free. And Mica's memory was officially tarnished with the shameful stigma of suicide. Although the police put a bold period on the Millers' case, the community was not going to give up. Relatives, friends, and concerned activists continued to seek the truth. They tirelessly reviewed news feeds, engaged bloggers and volunteers to conduct their own investigation. And soon, even more horrifying secrets of John Paul surfaced. It turned out that behind the mask of a pious pastor hid a real pervert and predator. Ex-wife Allison accused him of molesting underage parishioners and a sexual obsession with prostitutes. Several women confessed that in their youth, they had experienced harassment and even direct assaults from John Paul. One of them described in detail how the drunk Holy Father once forcibly dragged her into his car. Under the scrutiny of the public, other dark spots in Miller's biography surfaced as well. It was revealed that even before meeting Mica, he had drawn Allison into a scheme to embezzle church funds. Significant donations supposedly for the needs of the community ended up in the couple's pockets. The scheme was exposed when their marriage fell apart and the offended woman started talking. These revelations were supplemented by journalistic investigations that showed the true face of Solid Rock. Former parishioners recalled strange rituals of humiliation that Miller allegedly used to re-educate the disobedient. Others spoke about financial abuse and pressure from the church leadership. Gradually, a frightening image of a totalitarian cult emerged, hiding under the guise of a home for all. However, the most bewildering information concerned the mysterious death of Christopher Skinner, the husband of John Paul's alleged mistress. In 2021, wheelchair-bound Christopher drowned in the pool under extremely strange circumstances. That tragic incident was written off as an accident. But suddenly, journalists discovered that just before, Skinner had quarreled with his wife Susie, and the reason was her too close friendship with Miller. Of course, all these revelations did not prove John Paul's guilt in Mica's murder. But they eloquently demonstrated his true nature as an insidious manipulator and deceiver. And the fact that such a predator was at large only because of a formal alibi seemed like a glaring injustice. To somehow influence the situation, Mica's relatives and friends wrote an open letter to the sheriff's office and the FBI. They pleaded for the reopening of the investigation into Mica's death to examine new evidence of John Paul's abuse. Activists staged pickets, collected signatures, and involved television. The Mica Miller case was rapidly turning into a nationwide justice for Mica movement. Unfortunately, law enforcement was in no hurry to respond to the community's appeals. Despite the public outcry and moral condemnation, John Paul remained out of reach of the law. All his alleged crimes had happened so long ago that they fell under the statute of limitations. Formally, he was not even considered a suspect in the case of his wife's death. Disappointed by the system's indifference, Mica's relatives resorted to a last resort. In May, they filed a civil lawsuit against the pastor, accusing him of years of torture and incitement to suicide. It was an attempt to achieve at least symbolic justice and not let the perpetrator escape punishment. But did they have a chance to defeat the one who had not even been overcome by the criminal court? This still remains in question. Despite the bitterness of loss and anger at the injustice, Mica's relatives and friends tirelessly cherished her memory. They knew the world must remember this amazing woman not as a faceless victim, but as a bright, luminous personality, full of love and compassion. In May, 2 memorial events took place at once. The first was organized by the Solid Rock community. At it, John Paul delivered a moving speech, portraying his late wife as an angel who returned to God. Many people cried, some even applauded the pastor who bravely held up in the face of a terrible tragedy. But Mica's true friends understood perfectly well that this was just a mask to perpetuate the image of a holy sufferer. Therefore, the next day, they arranged their own, much more sincere commemoration ceremony on the ocean shore. there, where Mica loved to walk and dream about a better life. Gathered in a tight circle, relatives and friends shared memories of this kind, bright soul. About her sincere smile and infectious laughter. About how she always found time to listen, support, and comfort. How she believed in love to the end and strived to make the world a better place. Many recalled the prayer sessions Mica held for women in crisis situations. Her fervent, inspired appeals to God, full of faith in good and justice. No one could remain indifferent upon hearing her singing pure, crystal voice that seemed to soar from the heavens themselves. Her girlfriends jokingly called Mica the guardian angel of their small community. It seemed that you could always come to her with your pain, your doubts, and she would definitely find a way to help, to instill hope. Even when she herself was hurting and scared. But this angel, unfortunately, could not save herself from her own tormentor. Some secretly admitted feeling guilty for not being able to recognize the trouble in time. For believing too much in the bright packaging of the ideal family and not seeing the hell that hid inside. Mica's parents did not hold back tears, recalling how they once dreamed of giving their daughter in marriage to John Paul. After all, he seemed like the perfect Christian husband, kind, responsible, devoted to the church. Could they have imagined that in reality they were handing the girl over into the hands of a sadist? However, on this day, no one wanted to give too much energy to John Paul. Everyone understood that evil had already taken too much. Now it was time to focus on the good and light that Mica left behind. And it was this light that they wanted to carry through the years. Months passed, but activists did not stop trying to achieve justice. Loud actions and flash mobs under the slogan "Justice for Mica" swept the country. The hashtag of the same name spread on social networks, under which people shared stories about domestic violence and called for change. The Mica Miller case prompted many women and men to speak openly for the first time about their own experiences of abuse. Some dared to escape from their abusers and start a new life. Others found the strength to testify in court against their tyrants. So, invisibly and quietly, Mica continued to save those who needed it. But despite the noble intentions, the movement to reopen the case has not yet brought the desired results. The system remained deaf to the pleas of relatives and the public. John Paul, although he lost his position in the church, avoided any responsibility for his actions. He still remained at large and even, rumor has it, planned to open a new church. However, no matter how bitter it is to realize, even the punishment of John Paul will not bring Mica back to life. It will not lift the burden of grief from the hearts of her loved ones, will not fill the void of loss. But perhaps it can protect others, those unknown girls who risked becoming the next victims of the predator pastor. Therefore, the Mica Miller case is not over. Until justice is restored, until the abuser is free, until thousands of other Micas suffer in homes, the fight must continue. And let it be a tribute to the memory of that bright, pure soul who paid the highest price for her desire for happiness. The story of Mica Miller is a tragedy that, unfortunately, is not isolated in our world. Like thousands of other women, Mica became a victim of domestic violence, insidious, toxic, all-consuming. Her abuser resorted to the most sophisticated forms of abuse for years, from beatings and humiliation to gaslighting and psychological terror. But perhaps the most terrifying thing about this story is how easily the sadist managed to hide behind the mask of a respected pastor. John Paul was a master of manipulation. He knew how to inspire trust and respect. And he shamelessly abused this, turning God's word into a weapon against a defenseless victim. The Mica Miller case also exposed another sad truth: society's unpreparedness to adequately counter domestic violence. Too often, victims are left alone with their pain, too often their pleas for help go unheard. And abusers, especially influential and wealthy ones, get off scot-free. But this story should also be a call to action. Society must learn to recognize the alarming signals sent by victims of abuse. Never ignore their words, even if everything looks perfect from the outside. After all, in the hell of violence, there is no logic, fear reigns there. The state and law enforcement, in turn, are obliged to revise their approaches to investigating cases related to domestic violence. The practice of kicking out victims and placing responsibility for the actions of abusers on them should be a thing of the past. Instead, we need a clear algorithm for protecting and supporting the victims. And certainly inevitable punishment for tyrants. If anything good can come out of this tragedy, it is change. Changes in society's attitude towards the problem of violence, changes in church practices, changes in the justice system. And these changes must happen today. Otherwise, tomorrow we will again read in the news about someone's stolen fate and shattered dreams. So let the story of Mica Miller become not just a sad page in the crime chronicle, but an impetus for action. Let each of us think about how we can help those who suffer from violence. Even the smallest step of compassion and support can restore a victim's faith in life. And maybe someday it will save someone's bright angel from perishing in the claws of a predator.